Good afternoon. We are Group 3 and we're going to report the third part of this book, The Dynamics of Growth. It is divided into two parts. Chapter 9 is S-shaped growth, epidemics, innovation diffusion, and the growth of new products. And Chapter 10 is path dependence and positive feedback.
Hello everyone, I am Elaine Galion and I will be discussing the first part of Chapter 9, Modeling of S-shaped Growth and Dynamics of Disease, Modeling Epidemics. So to start with, our system initially dominated by positive feedbacks and eventually approaches the limit. There is a nonlinear transition from positive to negative feedback. The result is S-shaped growth where the growing population smoothly approaches equilibrium and then shifts to negative feedback. An important special case of S-shaped growth is known as logistic growth. This logistic model is important for several reasons. First, many S-shaped growth processes can be approximated well by the logistic model. Second, it can be solved analytically, and third, though intrinsically nonlinear, it can be transformed into a form that is linear. The total population of community or region represented in the model is divided into two categories: susceptible population and infectious population. For this reason, the model is known as SI model. As people are infected, they move from the susceptible category to the infectious category. The SI model contains two loops, the positive contagion loop and the negative depletion loop. Infectious diseases spread as those who are infectious come into contact with and pass the disease to those who are susceptible, increasing the infectious population at the same time depleting the pool of susceptible. People in the community interact at a certain rate. Some of these encounters with infectious people. The higher the contact rate, the greater the infectivity rate, the faster the pandemic or infection rate progress. Okay, so now we're gonna quickly switch a little bit more into the math and talk about this SI model. The infection rate is the total number of encounter multiplied by the probability that any of those encounters is with an infectious individual multiplied by the probability that an encounter with an infectious person results in infection. The dynamics can be determined by noting that without birth, death, migration, the total population is fixed. Susceptible plus infected equals the population. In the SI model, once an infectious individual arrives in the community, every susceptible person eventually becomes infected, with infection rate following a bell-shaped curve and the total infected population following the classic S-shaped pattern of the logistic curve. So at the beginning, there is an exponential growth because the susceptible people is still large, then eventually the growth slows down as the susceptible people decreases. Again, this is the simple model but gives us understanding of the behavior. While the SM model captures the basic process of infection, it contains many simplifying and restrictive assumptions. The population is assumed to be homogeneous. All members of the community are assumed to interact at the same average rate. The restrictive An unrealistic feature of the logistic model as applied to epidemics is the assumption that the disease is chronic. Many infectious diseases produce a period of acute infectiousness and illness followed by either recovery or development of immunity or by death. Kermack and McKendrick developed a model that is applicable to such acute disease, the SIR model. All other assumptions of the original SI model are retained, but in the SIR model, it adds another stock, which is the recovery population. This formulation is widely used in epidemiology. The assumptions that people recover creates one additional feedback, which is the negative recovery loop. The initial susceptible population is the total number of population less the initial number of infectives and any initially recovered and immune individuals. The recovery rate can be modeled as follows: infectious individual divided by the average duration of infectivity. In the SIR model, the average duration of infectivity represents the average length of time that people are infectious. The assumption that the recovery rate is a first-order process means people do not recover all at exactly the same time, but rather a given population of infectious individual will decline exponentially, with some people recover rapidly and others more slowly. So under what circumstances will the introduction of an infectious individual to the population cause an epidemic? The epidemic occurs when the infection rate exceeds the recovery rate. Second, when each infected passes the disease to more than one person prior to recovering. Third, the longer the average duration of infection, the weaker the negative loop and the more likely the epidemic will be. And lastly, if the positive contagion loop passes beyond the tipping point. According to Malcolm Gladwell, the tipping point is that magic moment when an idea, trend, or social behavior crosses the threshold, tips, and spreads like wildfire. Below the tipping point, the system is stable. Negative feedback dominates, and the population is resistant to an epidemic. There may be few cases, but on average, people will recover faster than new cases are generated. Past the tipping point, the positive loop dominates, the system becomes unstable. Once the disease arrives, it can spread like a wildfire. Figure 9-6 shows a simulation model of an epidemic in the SIR model wherein the system is well past the tipping point. The total population is 10,000, and initially everyone is susceptible to the disease. When a single infective individual arrives in the community, its average duration of infectivity is 2 days. Its average contact frequency is 6 people per day, and infectivity is 25%. Each infective therefore generates 1.5 new cases per day and an average of 3 new cases before they recover. Therefore, infection rate exceeds the recovery rate, and each infective passes the disease to more than one person prior to recovery. The next topic is about immunization and the eradication of smallpox. Smallpox was once the most deadly diseases throughout the world. Though the duration of infection is short, one must have a strong immunity to survive. This is one of the many infectious diseases that is highly contagious. Its infectivity is high and causes major death until early 20th century. It was Edward Jenner who developed the first effective vaccine in 1796. Despite its success though, it was only in 1950s that the vaccine was accepted because of the improved public health programs and shelf life of the vaccine. In 1960s, the World Health Organization tracked the disease, immunized the susceptible, and quarantined the sick. By 1980s, it was declared that the smallpox eradicated from the earth. Immunization, where vaccines are available, can be highly effective not only in protecting the immunized individuals but also in moving the entire population below the tipping point. Moving on is about herd immunity. It is when most of a population is immune to an infectious disease. This provides indirect protection to those who are not immune to the disease. For example, if 80% of a population is immune to a virus, 4 out of every 5 people who encounter someone with disease won't get sick. In this way, the spread of infectious diseases is kept under control. Depending how contagious an infection is, usually 70 to 90% of a population needs immunity to achieve herd immunity. Figure 9-9 shows how changes in the reproduction rate can dramatically change the response of a population to exposure. In the simulation, the population is challenged every 50 days by the arrival of a single infected individual. In this example, the periodic epidemics arise from assumed steady rise in the contact rate. The contact rate increases as population density grows. Cultural and social practices that bring people into more frequent contact, coupled with newborn babies, eventually the susceptible fraction of the population rises enough to push the system past the tipping point again, and the next wave of epidemic begins. The SIR model can extend to include age structure of population, birth, and death. With realistic parameters, the model creates an oscillation motion as the system repeatedly cycles above and below the tipping point. Next is about moving past the tipping point, the mad cow disease. What is mad cow disease? It is a progressive, fatal neurological disorder of cattle resulting from infection by a misfolded protein known as prion. It appears to be caused by contaminated cattle feed or meat and bone meal that contains the prion agent. In Figure 9-10, the epidemic spread rapidly, much faster than medical knowledge of it or the reactions of public health authorities. By mid-1980s, British public health officials knew that there was a new disease afflicting the cattle industry. Mad cow was first identified as the culprit in 1986. There was a further delay of several years before the UK banned the use of MBM as feed supplement. Due to long incubation delay, the confirmed cases continued to rise through 1992. The decline starts when MBM was banned. The last epidemic I will be discussing is about HIV/AIDS. Statistically speaking, there are more than 1.1 million people living with HIV, and more than 700,000 people with AIDS have died since the beginning of the epidemic. Figure 9-11 shows the incidence and mortality of AIDS in the US from 1984 through 1986. The data show important shifts in the dynamic of epidemic in the US. Incidence of clinical AIDS grew steadily until 1995 and has declined significantly since. Mortality closely follows incidence and exhibits an even larger decline. This is due to the development of therapies including AZT and HAART.
Part 9.3 Innovation Diffusion as Infection Modeling New Ideas and New Products. The diffusion and adoption of new ideas and new products often follows S shaped growth patterns. We'll consider the feedbacks that affects the movement or development of the growth of each model, which consider the positive that generates the initial exponential growth and the negative feedback that limits its growth. Let's consider the spread of cable television in Chapter 4. The growth of the population of cable television subscribers cannot be explained by the birth of children to existing cable subscribers. But we can observe that heavy TV viewers do tend to grow. Then, what are the positive loops responsible for the growth of this cable industry? In this part, we'll consider that idea. The spread of rumors and new ideas, the adoption of new technologies, and the growth of new products can all be viewed as epidemics, spreading by positive feedback as those who have adopted the innovation infect those who have not. The concept of positive feedback as a driver of adoption and diffusion is very general and can be applied to many domains of social contagion. For example, the feedback structure of the cocaine epidemic as described in Part 7. A rumor spreads as those who have heard it tell those who have not, who then go and tell still others, Once come into contact, the idea will be then spread to others and can be exponentially grow. As early adopters of new technology and early purchasers of new product expose their friends, family, and acquaintances to it, some are persuaded to try it or buy it themselves. In all these cases, those who have already adopted the product, the idea, or technology come into contact with those who have not, exposing them to it and infecting some of them with the idea or the desire to buy the new product and further increasing the population of others. In any situation in which people imitate the behavior, beliefs, or purchases of others, any situation in which people jump on the bandwagon describes a situation of positive feedback by social contagion. Of course, once a population of potential adopters have been depleted, the adoption, which is the infection, rate falls to zero. Going back in the cable television case, important factors in a household's decision to subscribe, let's assume that the cable is available in the area include favorable word of mouth from those who have already subscribed and positive experiences viewing cable at the homes of friends and family. People hear about programs only available in cable and feel they must subscribe to be hip and eligible among their peers in school or at the workplace. Additionally, people may subscribe to keep up with the Joneses, that is, to maintain or enhance their status or their perception of their status among their peer group. All these channels of awareness and motivation for adoption create positive feedbacks analogous to the contagion loop on the basic epidemic model. Looking at figure 13, which adapts the SI epidemic model to the case on innovation diffusion. The infectious population now becomes the population of adopters, set as A, those who have adopted the new idea or purchased the new product. The susceptible population becomes the pool of potential adopters, set as P. Adopters and potential adopters encounter one another with a frequency determined by the contact rate, set as C. Unlike infectious diseases, word of mouth encounters that might lead to adoption could occur by telephone, mail, email, or other remote means and do not require physical proximity. As in infectious disease, not every encounter results in infection. The proportion of contacts that are sufficiently persuasive to induce the potential adopters to adopt the innovation is termed here the adoption fraction and denoted as I, since the adoption fraction is analogous to the infectivity of a disease in the epidemic model. Let's run through some examples of logistic model of innovation diffusion. The diffusion of many new products follow roughly logistic trajectories. An example is Figure 9-14 shows the sales of Digital Equipment Corporation VAX 11 over 750 minicomputer in Europe in the year 1992. The VAX series was a very successful line of minicomputers. They sold for about $100,000 to $150,000 a unit depending on which peripherals such as tape drivers were included, an excellent value compared to the mainframes of the day. Typical customers were large companies, research organizations, and universities who used them for data processing applications and to support scientific and engineering computation in the research and development labs, product development departments, and academic research. The 11 over 750 product was introduced in 1981. Sales followed the classic bell-shaped product life cycle, peaking in mid-1984. The product was withdrawn from the market around 1989. Accumulated sales follow an S-shaped path. Since the useful lifetime of the VAX is long compared to the time horizon for the product life cycle, it is reasonable to assume that few units were discarded prior to 1989 when the product was withdrawn from the market. Therefore, cumulative sales is a good measure of the installed base. To fit the logistic product diffusion model to the VAX sales data, assume the total population, which is N, cumulative sales by 1989 about 7,600 units. The remaining parameter of the model representing the product of the contact rate and adoption fraction, which is CI, can be estimated easily by linear regression. First, recall from equation 9-8 that the solution to the logistic equation can be expressed using the variable names for the innovation diffusion model above as a over n minus a equals a sub o over n minus a sub o exponent of g sub o times t, where a is the number of adapters, the installed base, a sub o is the initial installed base, n is the total equilibrium or final value of adapters, and g sub o is the initial fraction growth rate of the installed base, which is the initial time when there are few adapters is equal to the number of effective contacts, Ci. Taking the natural logs of both sides, ln of a over n minus a equals normal log of a sub o over n minus a sub o plus g sub o multiplied by t yields a relationship that is linear in the parameters and can be estimated by ordinary least squares. Note that since n minus a equals p, which is the difference between the total population and the number of adapters is the number of potential adapters, equation 9-34 can be written more intuitively as a function of the ratio of adapters to potential adapters a over p. So that yields normal log of a over p equals normal log of a dash o over a sub p sub o plus g sub o multiplied by t. Equation 9-34 and 9-35 is known as the logistic or simply logit transformation. Figure 9-15 shows the logit transformation of the VAX sales data along with estimated linear regression. The data are close to linear, which indicates excellent correspondence to the logistic model. The bottom panels of figure 9-15 compare the estimated logistic curve to the sales and installed base data. While the logistic innovation diffusion model fits the VAC sales data quite well, the estimation of the model was retrospective. The entire sales history was used, and the estimation method required knowledge of the final value of the installed base. In most business situations, however, the clients want to know the likely growth path prospectively when the market potential is not known, so they can decide whether the market will be big enough to justify entry and plan strategy for capacity acquisition, pricing, marketing, and so on. One way to fit the logistic growth model to data prior to saturation is to estimate the rate at which the fractional growth rate declines when growing population. Recall from equation 9-1 that the fractional growth rate of the logistic model declines linearly as the population grows. Figure 9-16 shows the fractional growth rate in cable television subscribers in the US along with the best linear fit calculated by ordinary least squares. As expected, the fractional growth rate declines as the population grows, though there is considerable variation around the best linear fit. The logistic growth path implied by these parameters fits the data well through 1994 and predicts a maximum of about 74 million households subscribing to cable, reached shortly about after 2010. 9.3.3 The Bayes Diffusion Model. Frank Bayes developed a model for the diffusion of innovations that overcomes the startup problem. The Bayes Diffusion Model has become one of the most popular models for new product growth and is widely used in marketing strategy, management of technology, and other fields. Bayes solved the startup problem by assuming that potential adopters become aware of the innovation through external information sources whose magnitude and persuasiveness are roughly constant over time. The original Bayes model was introduced primarily as a tool for forecasting sales of new products, and Bayes did not specify the nature of the feedbacks at the operational level. The positive feedbacks is usually interpreted as word of mouth, social exposures, and imitations, and the external sources of awareness and adoptions are usually interpreted as the effects of advertising. As you can see in figure 9-18, the total adoption rate is the sum of adoptions resulting from word of mouth and explicitly other positive feedbacks driven by the population of adopters or the installed base of the product. and adoptions resulting from advertising and other external influences. Adoptions from word of mouth are formulated exactly as in the logistic innovation diffusion model shown in equation 9-3-1. Bayes assumed that the probability that the potential adopter will adopt as a result to exposure of given amount of advertising and the volume of advertising and other external influences each period are constant. Therefore, the external influences cause a constant fraction of the potential adopter population to adopt each time period. So, adoption rate, now AR, is the result of adoption from advertising plus adoption from word of mouth, wherein adoption from advertising is equal to AP, or A multiplied to P. Adoption from word of mouth is C multiplied to I multiplied to P multiplied to A over N, where the parameter A small letter advertising effectiveness is the fractional adoption rate from advertising, which is 1 over time period. The two sources of adoption are assumed to be independent. Collecting terms, the model can be expressed more compactly as AR equals A multiplied to P plus CIPA multiply I over N. When an innovation is introduced and the adopter population is zero, the only source of adoption will be external influences such as advertising. The advertising effect will be at largest at the start of the diffusion process and steadily diminish as the pool of potential adopters is depleted. In summary, to create realistic and useful models of product diffusion and innovation adoption, you must explicitly portray the feedback structure of adoption and growth, including the sources of attractiveness for the new idea or product, the competition, technical innovation, changing criteria of use, and other factors that influence adoption and growth. Many rich and insightful system dynamics of models of innovation diffusion have been developed and are used successfully to anticipate growth and design policies for success. Example is Homer in the year 1987 for a model of emerging medical technologies and urban, Husser and Roberts in the year 1990 for feedback models for pre-launch forecasting of new automobile models. The historical fit of a model does not show that the model is valid. Many models, each with different assumptions about the feedback structure and each generating different dynamics, can fit any set of data equally well. Ground your models in careful investigation of the physical and institutional structures and decision-making processes of the actors in the system. Second is don't force fit data into the assumptions of any pre-selected functional form or model. Models should not be used as exercise in curve fitting using the aggregate data. And lastly, only models that capture the causal structure of the system will respond accurately as conditions change and policies are implemented.
Hello everyone, I am Elaine Galion and I will be discussing the first part of Chapter 9, Modeling of S-shaped growth and dynamics of disease, modeling epidemics.
Hello, everyone. This is Chiki, and I'm going to continue discussing Chapter 10's topic, which is positive feedback, the engine of economic growth. So, with this discussion about positive feedback, we're going to look further into what drives the economic growth through product awareness, unit development, and production costs. Also, we need to take into consideration the network effects and complementary goods, product differentiation, new product development and market power, and mergers and acquisitions. We will also see what limits there are to lock in and some model behaviors for this chapter. So, to begin with, we need to understand that the growth of the business enterprise is driven by a host of positive feedbacks. These feedbacks involve scale economies, learning, network effects, market power, and many other processes. The most successful firms are able to create synergy by using ensembles of these feedbacks to create a mutually consistent strategy. So let's take a look how product awareness works. In here, in this diagram, we can see that we have four main channels, which is advertising, direct sales effort, word of mouth, and media attention. So for advertising and direct sales effort, we can see that the company has a direct control of how these will go into effect, while word of mouth and media attention are outside of the firm's direct control. Favorable word of mouth can stimulate media coverage, while things like product shortages can attract media attention, just like what is happening now during this pandemic. We have experienced a short supply of personal protective equipment, masks, face shields, and hand sanitizers and alcohol, and this has brought a lot of media attention recently. So, what do these things tell us? This tells us that larger advertising budgets have two effects. First, more potential customers are made aware of the product and choose to enter the market. To the extent the advertising is effective, and more of those who are aware and in the market are likely to buy the product of the company. Similarly, the larger the revenue of the firm is, the greater the sales budget. The more sales representatives, the greater their skill and experience, the more calls they can make, and the more time they can spend with the customers. And the share of their total demand will be bigger for the firm. Now let's go over to unit development and production costs. So let's first understand these following terminologies that is essential for us to fully grasp this topic. So, economies of scale refers when unit costs fall as the scale of production rises, at least up to a point. Economies of scope arises when a firm is able to share capacity, labor, technical know-how, and other resources across multiple product lines and business units. While learning curve arises as workers and firms learn from experience. As experience grows, workers find ways to work faster and reduce errors. So let's take a look at this causal loop. We can see here in figure 10-13 that these economies of scale, economies of scope, and learning curve both all produce reinforcing effects to the sales and in the process improvement overall. So the aggressive firm learns that pricing low, even below unit costs, can lead to market dominance and huge profits, while managers at the conservative firm learn to be even more conscious about projecting sales. Now let's go over to network effects and complementary goods. The utility of a product often depends on how many others are also using it and on the availability of compatible products to use it with. This is called the networked and complementary good effect. Compatibility and network effects boost product attractiveness and thus expand the total size of the market. As you can see here in this causal loop, these loops tend to favor the market share leader within an industry, assuming competing products are incompatible. Now let's go over to product differentiation. All positive loops will eventually encounter limits, and a firm will fail if they won't anticipate the fundamental changes. Firms can also invest in superior service and customer support infrastructure. To the extent these investments increase product attractiveness in the eyes of the customer. So most products can be differentiated from those of competitors through enhanced features, functionality, design, quality, reliability, and sustainability to the current and latent needs of customers. A good example of this company would be IBM. So back in 1980s, IBM successfully pursued the differentiation strategy for decades and dominated the computer industry from its inception through the personal computer revolution. IBM focused its differentiation strategy on product quality and reliability, building the largest and most responsive sales and service organization in the business. So now that we looked into product differentiation, let's proceed to new product development and market power. So in this causal loop, you can see that there is a reinforcing loop that is created by market power over suppliers and market power over labor and over customers. So let's first understand market power. So the larger the firm, the more clout it has with its suppliers, workers, and customers. Suppliers will be forced to give preferential treatment to their large customers on their delivery terms and payment schedules, to share technical knowledge, to respond to customer change requests, and etc. So this gives larger firms a very big advantage compared to smaller firms. We also have to consider that the core engine of growth for many firms is actually product development. So the greater the revenue of the company is, the larger and more effective their product development can be. So in order to protect their products, they can apply for patents, which offers an obvious method to protect such innovations and are critical to the success of the new product development loops. Now, let's go over to mergers and acquisitions. Growth can be powered by acquisition of rival firms, which is a horizontal expansion, and of suppliers and customers, which is a vertical integration. Acquisitions can also enhance economies of scale and scope, or permit firms to guarantee steady flow of complementary goods. So, the larger a firm is, the more capital it can raise to finance mergers and acquisitions. But we also have to take into consideration that negative loops arising from incompatible corporate cultures, over centralization, or loss of focus can dilute the earnings of the combined firm, ultimately leading to the divestiture or the desperate business units. So, considering all the positive feedbacks that we were able to understand a while ago, let's answer the question, if does the economy lock into inferior technologies? So, one consequence of path dependence is that random events early in the evolution of the system can push it down one path or another. The positive feedback amplify the differences among the contenders until one emerges as the standard and dominates the industry. If the dominant determinant of product attractiveness is compatibility and the availability of complementary goods, then a firm might become the market leader even though its technology is inferior. A more subtle issue concerns the coevolution of people's tastes with technology. People's preferences are not static, they evolve and change with experience. Your likes and dislikes adapt to your circumstances, so habituation is a powerful process. So now let's take a look in the limits to lock in. As what my group mate already explained a while ago about path dependence and the polya model, so it suggests that path-dependent systems rapidly lock into a stable equilibrium, which then persists indefinitely. For example, as computers became cheaper, more widely available, and easier to use, service and support became less important. As costs of the manufacturing fell while the complexity of the designs increased, upfront development costs became more and more important. As computing costs fell, computing became decentralized, so networking and compatibility became much more important. The very success of the computer industry in exploiting the positive innovation and product differentiation loops caused these feedback to weaken, destroying the effectiveness of these strategies that had created that success. Differentiation became less and less important, while compatibility became much more important. Success in a market dominated by compatibility, software availability, and economies of scale required aggressively low prices to generate the volume required to offset huge development costs and win the battle for market share. Lastly, let's go over model behaviors. So we have here some formulas in order for us to compute the market share of a product, the sales of a product, and total attractiveness of all the products. You can look all of these formulas in our reference guide, which was given by our professor, Business Dynamics. All of these are found in Chapter 10. So market share is determined by the attractiveness of each firm's products relative to the attractiveness of the other firm's products. So that's all for today, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you were able to understand dynamics of growth better with our report. Stay safe.